Hello and welcome to my review of Incompetence by Rob Grant. Rob Grant was 50% of the writing duo behind the British science fiction comedy Red Dwarf, which I absolutely loved in the 80s and 90s. The show is still running, but Grant left in the 90s. This 2003 novel is set in a not too distant future where the United States of Europe is a reality that includes Great Britain. Who knows, perhaps it will one day again. In fact, the rumours in the book are that Russia might well be on the verge of joining the EU, which becomes important later in the story. But the EU legislation is so bonkers, so insidiously connected to every little aspect of life, that it's a wonder how anything gets done. The legislation that states nobody can be discriminated against, even on the basis of incompetence, leads to a number of problems for our protagonist, Harry Salt. Salt is a secret agent of sorts who travels to Rome after one of the members of his cell and his recruiter is found dead in an elevator accident. He suspects foul play, but it's pretty hard to be sure in a world run by this level of stupidity. The elevator accident occurred because it was designed to reach 34 floors and the building only had 17. His mentor, Klingfirm, was apparently one of the dead. Salt tracks Klingfirm back to his home and finds a dry cleaner's ticket and a note saying to meet somebody at an address in Austria. Following these leads, Salt is met with all sorts of incompetence, as the title suggests. Planes that go to the wrong airport, trains with all the doors locked, nothing much works as it might, and all the places he goes are full of odd characters. The Italian police officer with anger management issues, a hotel worker who makes inappropriate sexual advances, a couple separated by one of them being declared legally dead, and a lawyer trapped inside a police station after being made redundant while visiting a client and finding that revoked his permit to be there. The plot is basically reduced to Salt needing to travel from Rome to Paris, then Austria, to meet a contact in the hope of finding out from them who would have need to kill Klingfirm. It is very loosely a murder mystery, and this review is going to spoil the ending, so watch out for the warning when it comes if you're concerned about preserving the mystery for yourself. The plot is basically negligible, an excuse for Grant to turn a scornful, satirical eye on a variety of British concerns, particularly and laboriously the trains. I've seen other people discussing this as commentary on the EU, and there is undoubtedly some of that, but predominantly I found this to be oddly un-EU in its concerns. Do other nations in Europe fret over trains as much as we do here in Britain? The section where Salt deals with a bureaucratic station master on a remote station built by accident in the middle of nowhere, the general uselessness of the train staff, the nonsense rules involved seem very much a British concern, even though the station is nominally on the Paris to Austria track. This part of the book is painful, dragging on and on and on as Salt clings to the train he has a ticket for but can't get on. It is pages and pages and never exciting or particularly interesting as satire. It's just long. And the same can be said for all of his interactions with the Italian policeman who follows him around Europe. Satire works better when you can't hear the cogs working in the author's brain, but Captain Zuko is a no-joke character inserted because he has to have some level of incompetence, but enough competence or at least tenacity to be a reoccurring annoyance for Salt. Likewise, the lovely Gina Pallister, the hotel worker, unable to detect sexual boundaries, but she reads like a 12-year-old's fantasy. The desire to date and then contact her to explain why he stood her up does at least impact the plot beyond the boundaries of the scene she is in, which is not true of far too much of this book. Mama and Papa, the two remote farmers that Grant uses to turn his scorn on the incompetence of government record-keeping and insurance companies, offer nothing. Their scene is more familiar than many dealing with both bureaucracies, is something most of us would have done at some point in our lives, but it's another lengthy aside from the plot that is used to shoe in a satirical look at something rather than actually relevant. Likewise, Hinton Wheeler is stuck in a prison holding cell for 3 years because his staff visiting rights were revoked when he was on the wrong side of a barrier. Salt saves him by getting him to assault a guard, thereby committing a crime and at least getting him processed into the system. But Salt himself, taken down 7 or 8 levels, crammed with unprocessed criminals, still expects to be processed and out in 24 hours. Wheeler will not affect the plot after his interlude is over. Strangely though, Salt's optimistic-seeming prediction comes true, and he is bailed out after a single night. The identity of his patron is kept a mystery, but that action in itself reveals who it is, and this is your spoiler warning. Slide to the time ahead to avoid it. Salt is taken to Disneyland Europe, an unfinished theme park that was abandoned by American investors who found EU regulations unwelcoming. There he meets the killer he's supposedly been chasing, and predictably it's Klingfirm himself. What is not predictable is Klingfirm's motive. He works for the Americans, who are seeking to sabotage the EU to stop it usurping the American position as the world's premier superpower. 2003, remember, but having been battered, and I do mean battered, by 300 pages of uselessness, it's difficult to imagine why they'd be concerned about an organisation ran like this. The end result is a finale that somehow manages to be both predictable and incongruous with its own text. And as bad as that is, it serves as a fitting capstone to a story that isn't so much a murder mystery as a series of loosely connected asides that Grant uses to turn his scorn on topics that actually feel just as oddly disconnected from his setting. The obsession with trains, as mentioned, seems peculiarly British. Perhaps not. Maybe German trains are just as bad. The petty bureaucrats are the same the world over. The hot-blooded Latin seems a stereotype even Italians would struggle to recognise in this form, and the farmers seem lifted straight out of Deliverance and plonked down in a location that is utterly generic. And like so much else in Incompetence, they have no relation to or impact on the murder mystery. Unencumbered with anything much that resembles an engaging story, Incompetence is clearly going to rely heavily on the strength of its lead, Harry Salt, a secret agent of some kind and a voice of sanity surrounded by idiots, a situation most of us will probably have considered ourselves in at some point. So you'd think that Harry would be very relatable, and initially he is. The book starts strongly. After the first line or two, I thought this was going to be something that I really enjoyed. The flight was uneventful enough, except the pilot accidentally touched down at the slightly wrong airport and forgot to lower the landing gear. I was hooked straight away, and when he followed that up with a seemingly interminable duel with a hotel restaurant worker who, due to a fault in the phone systems, is the only person he can contact, this scene rumbles on for a while, but it works for the most part. But on page 1, there is also a hint of Harry's default approach to problem solving. I punched a small hole in the bathroom wall. Harry will enlarge that hole long before he gives up on that phone call, and the scene begins to outstay its welcome. But what we also see is that Harry's reaction to whatever situation the incompetence of others causes is threats of violence and insults. Would it not be better if Harry could work through or around other people's stupidity? For example, Harry dials reception. He gets the restaurant instead, who try to put him through to reception, but the phone line only connects to the restaurant again, and the loop goes around and around. And if he could have broken that by, I don't know, asking for directory inquiries or something, working around the problem rather than resorting to anger, he'd look smarter and be less unpleasant. Because he is unpleasant, and he's the only character in the book that isn't specifically crazy or unspecifically stupid, but they can't help being awful, and he can but doesn't. So you can make a case that he's actually the worst of them all. His solution to Hinton's unofficial and unending incarceration gets the man savagely beaten. Could Grant not come up with a solution to them being locked up that used brains and didn't end with somebody being badly hurt? Because Harry's release comes from somebody else's actions. He doesn't even arrange that by himself. His solution to most problems that don't involve another human would see him dead, jumping on a speeding train or out of a speeding car, for example. But when another human is involved, their incompetence is simply overridden by his threats. The worst offence to plot and character is when Salt bullies the station master, saying, "If I'm not holding that ticket in my hand within 30 seconds, I'm going to come around the back of your little domain there, slap you to the ground, pull off your pecker and your love sacks with my bare hands, and whip you senseless with them while I make you my donkey bitch through the bloody new hole in your groin." A level of hilarity that ruptured rib cages everywhere, but a level of threat that does get the previously intransigent station master to issue the required ticket. But then, so terrified is he by Salt's menaces, he deliberately gives him the wrong platform number to keep Salt from getting on the train. The byproduct of that is that the man he's terrified of is still at his station and even angrier with him. Who does any of that make sense to? but it also confirms that Salt is a deeply unpleasant character. In a world ruled by this level of incompetence, Salt has to work with it, not batter through it. For example, if the station master is that useless, then ordering a ticket to Paris, where he's just come from, would surely see him issued with a ticket to Austria, where he wants to go. If the doors on the train are all locked because the train company is too stupid to realise its passengers can't get on the train, then the door keeping Harry off the train would surely fall off its hinges, or at least pull when it should be pushed. Having a lead that manipulates this stupidity to his own ends might well make him likeable. Salt does something similar, faking a memory problem to get a plane ticket, but it isn't quite the same as manipulating a system, and it's the only occasion he does try something different, and I rapidly began to dislike him, and the feeling only grew as the story went on. Last but not least, I think that for Grant this book was a labour. I say this not just because of his own acknowledgement that publisher and agent spent a long time waiting for it, but because the premise, this world ruled by incompetence, is a million times better than the execution. Scenes are generally too long, not a surprise when the book is, as mentioned, randomly disconnected scenes stitched together, but Harry is hanging on to the outside of a train for 22 pages. He deals with the station master for 20 more. That's 42 pages of a total of 322, so between 10 and 15% of the entire length of the book. That is irrelevant to what the story is actually about. There's a long scene in which a mortician shows Salt the dubious art he makes out of cadavers that again has no bearing on the actual plot. The Miranda rights are now a 3-page document, which wasn't funny in Snow Crash either, if you're wondering, but Grant relates the whole thing. Chapter 36 runs to 10 pages and relates in the form of a transcript a news report about what happened to Salt's car after he abandoned it. Not the least funny part of the book by any means, but again has no impact on the story that is very nominally being told here. The best thing I can say about the book is that it is sporadically funny. The first line was great. A shop worker without the specific syndromes and other labels applied to his colleagues, being proud of his condition being designated non-specific stupidity, is funny. The scene with a waiter trying to work with a permanent erection isn't great here, but might have worked better on screen than page. The helpful Samaritan offering to perform CPU is about as good as the rest of it gets, and the rest feels more spiteful. 9 o'clock, Friday morning. Right, set your watches, people. I'll be there. And just in case you're American and having trouble wrapping your head around irony, I'll add the following: not. With it now? I just don't understand why there's a need for that. And even for the irony challenged, I feel it's better to let something pass over their heads than berate them for it. Also consider the difference in tone between the passage that I just read, the first lines of the book, and this, and how much more amiable it seems. But at page 144, we're not quite halfway through, and it's suddenly become quite unpleasant. In conclusion, I feel that the funniest part of this book is that whenever I have high expectations of something, I end up being brutally disappointed by it. It feels like that's actually becoming a theme. Incompetence, though, is largely plotless, a disjointed and spiteful satire of things that are set in the EU in the book, but don't feel very European. As an Englishman, you'd think I'd enjoy both the send-up of the EU and the British involvement with it, and a send-up of some of our own sensibilities. But after a great opening, I rapidly began to dislike the protagonist, and his story is little more than a road trip or rail trip, and I disliked that too. Sporadic moments of comedy fail to lift a generally uninspired and laboured effort, disappointing and very hard to recommend. Having spent 20 minutes complaining about somebody else's comedy, I have to set myself up for a big fall. However, it would be remiss of me not to recommend my own book, Sexton Lovecraft versus the Fart-Powered Prophecy Machine, which also includes for free the short story Do Perverts Dream of Inflatable Sheep? Back it on Kickstarter, but make sure if you do that you pick the perk that includes the book.